you read these numbers, venture capitalists raised $100 billion in change last year. But when you dive into the data, you'll realize half of that money went to maybe 24 firms or so. And what you realize is while venture capital, there's a lot of money in the ecosystem, it's pretty concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of firms. And so what ends up happening is because those firms have a disproportionate amount of the capital, and like I said earlier, venture capitalists tend to fund what they find interesting, the preferences and interests of a relatively small number of people are dramatically overrepresented in terms of what gets funded. And those people are able to accumulate large amounts of capital because they have good historical returns or they're good at marketing their funds to the kind of people who want to invest in venture funds. So it's not to criticize them for a lack of performance or anything, but they represent such a large concentrated pool that like the things they like are going to get funded. And the things that they don't like are going to have a much harder time finding access to capital. And I think that's structural. I think the other thing that's structural is in most venture capital firms, they are very undemocratic. You have a very small number of people at the top who are in charge, who largely dictate what the firm is going to invest in, how capital is going to be allocated across partners. And so what you really end up with is half of the money in the industry is in the hands of a very small number of firms, and those very small number of firms are effectively managed and controlled by a very small number of people. So if you really zoom out, there's a very small number of people who set the agenda for about half of our industry. And that's a big structural. Yeah.
And it's an industry that controls innovation in the world.
And it's an industry that decides who gets funded.
So you're saying that a handful of people actually are really the mafia behind almost how we allocate innovation-driven dollars.
And I think in many areas they have good judgment. So it's not to say that like they're flawed individuals, but I would say structurally, like that's one of the constructs of venture. And so people say, wow, we have all of these small venture funds, like why isn't anything changing? I'm like, well, because all of those small venture funds, even if they moved in concert or maybe half the size of that core group of big venture funds that has most of the money.
And is there a way to change that? So we are in the School of Entrepreneurship. We're in the Entrepreneurship Center in the School of Engineering. So every challenge is an opportunity. This seems like a systematic challenge, and it almost seems like one where it's a bunch of good intentions that have created this very perverse outcome. If you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to change it, do you have any thoughts on how you could change the structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more existential question to me is like, we have this concentrated industry. Do those players behave that way because that's who they are, or do they behave that way because they've ascended to a tier and size in the industry where they have outsized power? And I think that traditionally, like what's happened for most venture firms is like as you're more successful, people want to give you more money, and most VCs are not in the business of not taking money. So people give you more money. Your firm gets larger, you become more powerful. And my big question is like, well, what's the chicken and what's the egg? Is it that like you start off with good intentions, and then as you get larger, it becomes harder to deliver on those intentions? Or is it that the people who end up getting large have a different set of values and intentions in the first place? So what I would say is if I wanted to disrupt the industry, I think the people who have a chance to break it, I mean, I look at Andreessen Horowitz, that fund is 12, 14 years old? Not that old.
Yeah, and how many billions?
They went from $0 to $54 billion under management, probably the third or fourth largest venture fund in the country in 15 years. And they have, in many ways, changed elements of our business and the way that other VCs behave. I look at Y Combinator. Y Combinator is 20-ish, maybe 15, 20 years old also.
Yeah.
YC changed the way that early stage startups get built and funded. So I think the way to change venture capital is to build an institution that causes everybody else in the ecosystem to behave differently. Very hard to do. But when you do that, you can actually change the rules of the game.